Well, anyone who's taken 8th grade English remembers the ominous phrase, Big Brother is watching you. It turns out Big Brother is watching us, okay? So maybe it's maybe not Big Brother per se, but many employers everywhere are keeping tabs on their workers in ways even George Orwell could not have imagined. Those same data points that employers use to maximize profits, which raise questions in and of itself, can also be used as a tool of surveillance and control and discrimination. Our next panel of labor leaders, technology and policy experts take a deep dive into this issue and how unions are pushing back through organizing, bargaining, and legislation. So if you have questions that you want to direct to today's guest, please submit questions again to sagaftra.org/summit questions. That's sagaftra.org/summit questions. And to lead this important discussion, it's great to introduce Amanda Ballantyne, director of the AFl-CIO's newly created Technology Institute. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And thanks to all of our brothers and sisters at SAG-AFTRA for hosting this important event today and for making space for the broader labor movement to participate this afternoon. It's really important work. Over the past several generations, tremendous public investment has gone into research and development of the basic technologies that are enabling dramatic shifts we're seeing right now in core industries, from automation to artificial intelligence and machine learning. But that investment in the R&D process, our investment, hasn't always guaranteed that the implementation of these new technologies in our core industries necessarily will improve the nature of work or increase equity for working people in our society. In fact, we've seen income inequality skyrocket in our society in the past several decades. New technologies can improve the experience of work, but they can also be used to degrade work and create dehumanizing conditions. In our next panel, we're going to talk about how new technologies designed to track and control employee performance are enabling employers to use disturbing worker surveillance tactics that degrade work, dehumanize workers, and really have a chilling effect on worker organizing. And we'll hear that these algorithms disproportionately impact women and BIPOC people, exacerbating racial inequity in our society. Today, we'll ask David Mertz to kick off our conversation. David's assistant to the president at the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. He's going to talk today about the experience of workers who are right now trying to organize a union in Amazon.com's Bessemer, Alabama warehouse. We'll also hear from Aiha Nyugen, program director for the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society, who's going to discuss the broader consequences of the types of surveillance programs that Dave discussed in Bessemer, Alabama. Then we'll hear from Michelle Penson, who is Deputy Director of the Data and Analytics Department at the AFl-CIO. She's going to speak directly to the ways in which algorithmic management creates and amplifies racial and gender bias. And then finally, we'll hear from Michelle Miller, who's co-founder and executive director of coworker.org. She'll tie together a number of these threads and set up for us a conversation about policy and bargaining solutions. The real point of this conversation, of course, is that we have choices about the future we want to create. Are we going to create guardrails on employer behavior and use policy to incentivize companies to improve the quality of work and make society more equitable? There certainly are things that we can do with public policy and with worker organizing that can shape the future of work in the interest of working people and in the interest of increasing equity in our society. But this requires a deep level of engagement, particularly from working people and the labor movement. So let's get started. Dave, can you please kick us off? Tell us what's going on in Alabama.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I'm happy to do so. I'm happy to be here. I'm not particularly happy about what's taking place in Bessemer in terms of how Amazon is behaving. What I am incredibly excited about is what's happening with the workers who are standing up and they're speaking out under it's been an incredibly challenging environment. When we talk about surveillance, it's played a very big role in this campaign and monitoring and how people feel that they're just being watched. The big brother that Gabrielle spoke about. It's real. It's out there, and it's oppressive. When we talk about how technology has played a role in this campaign, and how the monitoring has played a role, it's good to think of it almost in terms of like three broad-based ways, right? The first way is how the company actually communicates with workers, right? And workers in the facility first started reaching out to us because they felt a complete disconnect at their workplace from how they were being managed. They're being managed by an app. They rarely had ever spoken to any managers. They would just get a notification on their phone telling them that maybe they had been disciplined for something. Some were even terminated that way. We heard from workers who said, we're not even sure if they're actual people behind this. They treat us like robots. But we're pretty sure they might be robots themselves, and it's this weird kind of dystopian environment where people feel that they're just being treated as disposable parts of a bigger machine by a larger machine. And whether or not that's actually true, that is certainly how folks experience it. So there's that piece. There's a second piece of this, and that's how the company tracks workers. From the minute they start working to the minute they stop, workers are being monitored. And it's ostensibly for their productivity rates, but they are measuring ultimately how much time they're spent working and how much time they're spent not working. And they have a phrase called time off task, and they use that to determine whether or not a worker is meeting what their productivity rate should be. If they don't, they could be disciplined. And so, for example, if a worker needs to use the bathroom, that is time off task. That might ultimately be used to discipline them. We've heard from pregnant workers who said they felt that they were being pressured not to take bathroom breaks that they needed to take, and other workers who said they couldn't take bathroom breaks because they knew they were being monitored and they knew that it could potentially be used against them. And it's a very disturbing feeling that every movement you're making is being cataloged. And that goes as far as like your movements within the facility, and whether or not, again, it's something that is actually being done. Workers have a sense that their physical location is constantly being monitored, and other workers' physical location is being actually monitored. And it doesn't take much of a leap to feel that it's like, well, possibly they're keeping track of who I'm talking to. And in this day and age, who knows what else they're monitoring and keeping track of. And that goes to the third impact, and that's about perception. I think, the idea that a lot of workers have expressed to us is they feel that Amazon has the ability to not only track them at work, but to possibly track them in other aspects of their lives. And again, that may or may not be true, but because of that perception, it has a chilling effect on workers' willingness to engage with the union campaign at times. So if you feel that it's like you're being tracked about who you're talking to in the facility, and there's someone who's a union supporter, if you're a person who may be a little concerned about that sort of thing, about maybe being, getting a black mark, you might think twice before you speak to that worker. If you take that one step further and you think that monitoring and surveillance could be extended outside of the facility, whether or not that's true, if that's the perception, it can have a chilling effect on workers' behavior, whether or not they would go to a union hall per se. So it's a disturbing situation for workers to contend with all these things. But with all that being said, workers are, standing up and they're speaking out and they're getting engaged in the union campaign in a way that has been, very inspiring to a lot of us. But it still is, it's a Herculean task to take on a company that has at its disposal almost infinite resources. So the world's wealthiest man, a company with the money and the technology to be able to track what workers are doing. There have been very highly publicized cases of Amazon at Whole Foods having what they called heat maps, where they were actually using different ways of measuring whether or not a store might potentially be unionizing, or that workers may actually have more progressive leanings, and that they should, the company should then have managers out there to dissuade workers from doing that sort of thing. We've seen that play out at the Amazon facility in Bessemer, where the overwhelmingly African-American workforce in a part of the Deep South has taken to the campaign not only as something around labor rights, but also around civil rights. It's become, a sort of some bigger issues are at play here. And the company, instead of trying to respond those concerns, instead of trying to engage in some of those concerns, has been using, their vast wealth to try to crush workers from exercising the right to organize. Workers are subjected to, we call them captive audience meetings. The company euphemistically calls them union education meetings. They really are re-education meetings. There's no other way of looking at it. It's really disturbing stuff that workers, as a condition of their employment, have to attend meetings day in and day out, from sometimes an hour at a time, to hear the company's side of the propaganda. And the workers know that they're being monitored and that they're potentially being recorded in those meetings. So it puts a chilling effect on them even being able to freely engage at that moment.
Thanks, Dave. It's certainly disturbing. And I just want to shout out all of the workers who are organizing. It's a really inspiring campaign and very, very important sort of foothold in starting to organize the industry. So thanks for joining us today. I'm going to pass this over to Aiha Nyugen, who's Program Director at the Labor Futures Initiative at Data and Society. Aiha.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, David, for giving us a real understanding of what's happening in warehouses. I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of the things that we're seeing in warehouses can be more broadly talked about in terms of work in general. And while such tools aren't necessarily intended just to make workers' lives difficult, it does, because algorithms and surveillance is also not neutral. It works for who controls it, and that currently is mostly employers. And so we need to think about how surveillance and algorithmic management are creating some negative consequences for workers. So some of what we're seeing in Amazon warehouses is technologically driven speed up and work intensification, right? Workers being subjected to time off tasking, having a rate that they have to accomplish. And we see this in many other industries as well, retail establishments and call centers, where workers' performance is recorded and measured. And these devices collect that information and then immediately provide real-time feedback to workers, who are then pushed to work faster. And in other instances, it also creates a sense of uncertainty and precarity, because these employment decisions, including discipline and dismissal, are based on metrics collected that workers often don't see, and they don't know how they arrived at this particular score, but that score is then being used to make employment related decisions about them. Another trend that we're seeing that can be sort of broadly shown across multiple industries and work is sort of a shifting of the costs of operations onto workers. And a good example is the trend of lean scheduling and just-in-time scheduling. This is not new. Employers have been doing this for a very long time, particularly in retail, but it's been intensified with automated scheduling technologies that determine hours and shifts by essentially trying to predict how much labor is going to be required and then keeping that staffing at a minimum level. And these systems pull in historic information about customer foot traffic, customer reviews, and even weather patterns in order to make these decisions. The consequences for workers is very erratic and precarious schedules. So workers are essentially assuming the responsibility for employers creating very lean schedules. And finally, I think Dave may have touched a little bit on it, but there is also a growing use of collection of biometric data on employees and workers. And this has kind of happened previously, whether it was like a health app or pieces of technology on one's body, and particularly in certain industries like sports. You know, players are having technologies actually put on their body constantly, whether it's a helmet, or there's even a story about some football players having beds that have sensors and monitors that can determine how well they're sleeping, because this is tied to performance. The problem is there's not a clear connection between these biometrics and performance. It's kind of like a tenuous situation. With COVID-19, that's becoming an even bigger issue. So many workers are being asked to have their temperatures checked and maintain a 5-foot distance, filling out health surveys. And even in the entertainment industry, there was the body statistics and the sound of a person's voice, their face. There was a session earlier about deep fakes. Deep fakes are incredibly important because it's what performers make a lot of how they make their livelihood. And deepfakes is, if you think about it, a form of stealing someone's biometric information. It is so core to who they are and importance. And finally, what we're also seeing is the surveillance, data collection, and the resulting profiling of Black, Indigenous, and people of color continues and intensifies in a work context when there is so much surveillance and technology on someone. It has the capacity to very clearly single out an individual, but can also collectively make a particular judgment and about entire class of people. So, the presumption of like bad behavior, workers who may steal, workers who may shirk their responsibility. And some of these judgments are being used in order to determine future job opportunities. And I think I will end by just saying that what we've seen in talking to workers is leading to a sense of overreach. Like, where does it end? When can my boss follow me? If I'm a gig worker, if I'm a platform worker, that's on my phone. And every time I log into work, it's follow me, and it'll follow me when I get home. So, and even the questions of like, can my boss ask to put a camera in my face while I'm driving? What if it's my own car? So overreach has consequences, and part of it is it's normalizing surveillance and data collection and making it easier. And as a consequence, it's easier for employers to demand more information. And I think the consequence that we're feeling is that workers are left with an unclear understanding of the purpose of a particular technology and are disempowered from contesting the surveillance or the data collection and subsequent employment decisions that are made about them, because there's this sense that employers have the right to establish, productivity measures or a right to surveil. But this is also very disempowering. And so having this conversation about what workers and unions can do is critical at this moment.
Thank you so much, Aiha. That overview and those specific examples, I think, are really helpful in showing how pervasive this type of technology and surveillance already has become, and also how it's sort of an amplification of the type of surveillance that's existed really throughout the last several decades in terms of performance tracking. I want to see if Michelle Penson, you could pick up on some of the discussion that I had generated on racial equity and algorithms, and really sort of talk us through what is an algorithm and how does it discriminate?
Definitely. It's important to know that surveillance and monitoring as a means of control of the means of production is nothing new in our country. It goes back as far as slavery. So it's important to remember that this has just been growing over time. When we think about algorithms, what we're talking about is mathematical decision makers. So a set of data is collected, it is piped into a machine, a formula generates information out of it, and then decisions are made. The example that Dave gave us about the apps that are telling people that they are being disciplined or even firing them, the app, that's an example of an algorithm making a decision based on anything from the haptics, so the movement around a place, the sounds that are being collected. And the examples that we've been given are just a small chunk of what's possible and what's happening. So earlier in another presentation, there's a conversation about the biometrics. I had talked about biometrics. Dave has talked about the extreme amounts of tracking and recording that are happening inside the Bessemer, Alabama warehouse. But it goes so much further. You think that hotel cleaners, for example, have apps that dictate what room they clean first. Instead of going room by room in an orderly fashion, pushing a 200-pound cart, they zigzag back and forth, retracing their steps, which makes it difficult for them to actually meet the goals that are being set for them. And so it sets them up for failure. It sets them up to end up not meeting the goals, and they could possibly be disciplined or lose their jobs. And it's purely happening via these applications. And so, another example, we're talking about nurses earlier and what they're going through in a COVID-19 period of time, they now have, in some hospitals, badges that record all sound and all video. So there's no privacy. There's no ability to feel like you're not being watched. It is this constant repeat of somebody is watching you, Big Brother is watching you. And a lot of these particular fields are fields where you find a lot of women, a lot of people of color and BIPOCs. And so these are the people who are most impacted by the fact that, you know, they're being watched on a deep level, and they are being judged by something is seen to be unbiased, you know, that algorithms, because it's a computer and it's science, it must be clinical, it must be able to make decisions that are without bias. But unfortunately, because algorithms are built by humans and humans are inherently biased, every algorithm is biased as well. And algorithms learn. So the more information, the more data they collect, the more they're able to make decisions and figure out how best to do things by the virtue of the algorithm. So if you pump in bias, it will exponentially grow because the system will learn that bias as well. And there is no way to pull that back once you've got it started. So data is being collected on workers, goes into this black box where algorithms are making decisions, and those decisions are deciding the livelihoods of workers every single day. And they have no say. It is shocking how little workers have to say in the data that is being collected on them, the way that it is being stored, whether it is safe, how it's being used, and whether or not it generates income on behalf of the employer that's collecting it. Workers have no say in this, and it's just another form of exploitation.
Michelle, thank you. That was really, I think, helpful in digging deeper into algorithms and helping people really understand kind of how pervasive this is. I want to pass it to Michelle Miller, who's also a national expert in a lot of these surveillance and tracking details. And I was hoping, Michelle, that you could kind of weave some of these threads together and talk to us a little bit about solutions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to David, Michelle, and Aiha for the overviews that you provided. In order to get to solutions, I think it's really important to take a step back and talk a little bit about the root causes of and the creation of an economy that is so predicated on data as a commodity. A lot of the software that we've been talking about throughout this conversation is software that is built to extract as much data as possible. The extraction of that data is built on limitless surveillance, and that sort of model for software development really started happening in Silicon Valley about 10 to 15 years ago, initially in order to better target profile consumers, to target ads toward them. And over the past few years, in order to build, as Michelle described, more intelligent artificial intelligence systems. And it is I think it's important to sort of talk about that because it also situates the workplace software that we're talking about in this conversation with a proliferation of basically the same software across multiple other sectors of the economy. So the way people access housing, the way people access credit, the way people find out about educational opportunities, the way people are tracked through the immigration system, the way people are tracked through the mass incarceration system, and the way that people are able to access social welfare. The logic of the systems that we're looking at inside workplaces is also present inside of all of those other systems that rate people's worthiness to access the goods and services that they need to survive, and their ability to be safe and protected from interference from the state. And what we know is that people of color, specifically the Black community, the Muslim community, and the immigrant community, are significantly tracked and surveilled by multiple entities on a daily basis. So when we think about that in the context of the workplace, What we are actually up for addressing is a much broader kind of privatized surveillance state that has impacted every aspect of people's lives. I really appreciated the way that David laid out the multiple ways in which employees at the Amazon warehouses are tracked. Those same employees, then go into their own communities where Amazon has relationships with the police through their Ring cameras, attempt to access cloud services, which are run on Amazon Web Services, just like the rest of us. And this is all a piece of Amazon's effort to create a data monopoly such that they can control vast sectors of the economy and rake in more income. So when we think about solutions, we really want to think about solutions that both take into account the labor abuses that are possible when you are implementing these kinds of technologies that monitor people so closely, and then also the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure that has been implemented that incentivizes surveillance and mass data extraction. Because if we only address these problems inside of people's workplaces, they will disproportionately benefit white workers, while people of color who are generally surveilled in multiple other contexts will continue to be surveilled by these same companies. It won't be at work, but it will be in all of these other places. And what we know, especially a coworker where we support a lot of people who are engaged in first-time organizing and who don't have access to institutions, they use a variety of different technologies, popular technologies that they access through their daily lives in order to engage in organizing. So the organizing that they're doing is not just happening while they're at work, but while they're doing a variety of other activities in their own communities and the way that they're building networks within their own communities. So there are a couple of policy proposals that are up for addressing these issues. There is a workplace-specific bill that is being looked at right now, that the positives of it are specifically that it addresses the use. It basically says no use of psychological profiling or behavioral analytics software, which from an organizing perspective is really important because so much of that psychological profiling is really, it's built on threat detection software. And in the workplace, that threat is essentially the person who might organize the workplace. It requires employers to provide an explanation for the ways in which algorithms that are managing pieces of people's workday are being used. It also says that algorithmic decision-making cannot be used in performance assessment, that people cannot be penalized based on a decision that the algorithm made. So there are a number of really incredible and transformative pieces within this bill. But again, my concern is that if we really only address this issue through what is mostly productivity technology inside of workplaces, then the impact that this surveillance technology and the surveillance infrastructure has on freedom of association and the ability to organize will still not actually be met. The second attempt is more around data transparency and within a privacy framework. And this is about basically built on the kind of GDPR model in Europe, which forces companies to provide notice, mostly to consumers, about the way in which their data is being collected and used. And in that context, I'm just not easy to satisfy, so I'm also not satisfied with that bill. That context really focuses the impact on consumers and doesn't think about the power differentials that operate within inside workplaces and make consumer-based solutions not quite right for work. So I think that both of those things together start to get at the problem, but fundamentally what we want to do when we're addressing these issues is really address the monopolization of data and the power imbalance between workers and their employers. And the places where we've seen that become possible are in union negotiations and in worker organizing. What Unite Here has been able to do for hotel workers, what the NFL Players Association has been able to do for football players, which is negotiate terms around the extraction and collection of their data and the use of workplace technologies.
Thank you, Michelle. I think it's really helpful to kind of provide that overview of the broader social implications, and also kind of what policies are out there right now that we should be looking at and thinking about. I want to extend that question to other panelists. Really, given all the things we've discussed, what are the types of guardrails that workers and worker advocates should be fighting for right now? And do they stop with these workplace protections? What's the interest of extending those policies further to protect more aspects of people's lives? Aiha, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can. I would 100% agree with Michelle that the existing legislation to provide consumer data privacy needs to extend to people. It's the same people while they're at work. If you protect someone as a consumer from discrimination and fraud, but you don't do it when they're in a work context where they're also subjected to similar harms, it really doesn't really address the whole individual. And I think Europe's general data protection regulation has been very specifically provides protections as workers, as job seekers. So this is a much more holistic understanding of what it means to protect us from like unnecessary, wanton, and unrestricted surveillance and data mining. But I think that there is also a need to like take a values stand that maybe some things just should not be surveilled. And if you look at sort of, the history of surveillance of people of color, of immigrants, they have said no, because the fact of the matter is the surveillance is not just about their data, it's about the control of them as a people to make sure that they're not a threat. And in some ways, workers are a threat. Employers see workers as a threat. Organizing is viewed as a threat. Unionization is viewed as a threat. So, I think it's important to take that stand in some instances as well.
Thanks. Dave and Michelle Penson, talk to us about the role of organizing in building power for workers. I'm getting a number of audience questions about how workers can protect themselves. So talk to us about the role, I guess, both of organizing for you, Dave, but then Michelle, also for you, bargaining.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of organizing, there's no better way for workers to protect themselves than by joining together in collective action. I mean, there are certain legal protections that are available, while not great and often easily, broken by well-financed employers, do offer some level of protection, during those moments in organizing. But unfortunately, the laws are in that aspect are not nearly strong enough as well. And so it's like when in terms of like looking at, reining in some of the abuses of surveillance and monitoring, we also need to be looking at our laws in which, protect or should protect workers who are organizing to be able to speak out and to be able to challenge their employers, free from the fear of being, terminated or harassed. And frankly, our laws currently don't really allow that kind of protection. So one without the other, you're only getting a partial solution. And that worker empowerment, at least from my perspective, is always going to be the answer to how workers can best protect their interests.
Right. And just to put in a plug for the PRO Act, which would dramatically expand the right to organize unions and protect a lot of what you're talking about. Michelle, talk about bargaining.
So when it comes to thinking about bargaining, there have been really great examples of where union locals have been able to actually impact how technology is used, how data is collected. The NFL Players Association example, the Unite Here example. These are cases where the workers actually said it is unacceptable for you to collect this data and for me not to have a say in it, and for me to have technology, forced upon me in my workplace without any sort of information or notice or anything of that nature. And so bargaining gives us the opportunity to actually dig into spaces where there are not yet policies in place in order to be able to get workplaces to be in a better situation when it comes to the introduction of technology. And I think it is important for unions that haven't yet done this to find an opportunity to look at how it's been done, to find examples and try to do the same thing, because technology is here, right? management by algorithm is here. We are not going backwards. There's nothing we can do about that. So the best we can do is try to put some guardrails around it, try to control it a little bit, and to make sure that workers actually have a say in that. I think another thing to keep in mind outside of bargaining as well is, you know, when it comes to algorithms, you have to think about who is writing them, who actually has the job to decide what data points matter, how they are weighted, and what happens when that data is crunched. And largely the group of people who build these algorithms are white, they're young, they're male. And so there's not a lot of data that's being taken into consideration because they don't even necessarily do these jobs or have a lot of information about how to do these jobs in order to build algorithms that are effective and efficient. And so we have to diversify the group of people who are doing this type of work in order to bring different voices and different viewpoints into how this data is being collected.
That's really helpful too. And I think that, just to put an aside, the AFl-CIO's New Technology Institute is really taking on some of that work in trying to upstream worker voice in the development and R&D process. You know, so I think there, in addition to sort of policy and bargaining solutions, there are other ways that worker advocates can insert themselves into the creation of tech. And whoever is involved in the creation of tech does also shape what that tech does. It's an important point. I wonder, I'm getting a number of questions, and you are all organizers, but I'm getting a number of questions from the audience about surveillance of personal social media and organizing campaigns on social media. And I'm just wondering, kind of, I know a number of you would probably have great perspectives on this, but how do we think about organizing and the blurry lines, the increasingly blurry lines between what's the shop floor and what's someone's personal life? How does social media play into that? Who wants to start?
I can give it a shot.
Okay.
You know, a lot of what Coworker does is built on organizing that starts in places like Reddit threads and Facebook groups, and these kind of informal gathering spaces that people have been using. And I think one way to address this is going to sound a little sideways, but one way to actually address like the use of social media to monitor and surveil employees is to actually think about the fact that currently Facebook is a monopoly that dominates all of the places where people are actually able to gather and communicate with one another. And so if we address the facts of tech monopolies sort of having sucked up all of the space on the internet, which is no longer the free and open space it was maybe 10 to 15 years ago for people to gather, then we start to help people create spaces where they can communicate with one another informally, that isn't so easily in the purview of employers. I think related to that, one of the things that we are thinking a lot about at Coworker is the debate around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which for very good reasons, many people are concerned about, because currently when hate and disinformation is spread on platforms, the platform owners are not held responsible for facilitating that. The other side of that is that Section 230 makes it possible for people to come together on platforms like Reddit and Facebook and coworker.org to discuss their working conditions without having a company be able to wipe out the platform because they have decided that the platform itself is responsible for the speech that is being used on that platform. And so we have really deep concerns about the ways in which tech policy is going to go over the next 5 to 10 years around the governance of these platforms in order to protect and preserve people's right to freedom of association. What we know is generally when regulatory infrastructure is put in sloppily, quickly, and without thinking through the implications all the way. What happens is that corporations get to continue doing the thing that they had been doing before, and they just like have a little money on the side to placate whatever the costs are. And the people with less power who've been using that same infrastructure end up getting locked out. So I think that that if we want to address concerns around employer surveillance or manipulation of social spaces where people are gathering, we also have to think about the fact that there are limited spaces right now for people to do that in the first place, and we should address the prevalence of those monopolies.
Thanks, Michelle. How is the same theme, organizing and surveillance outside of the workplace, impacting your work, Dave?
Yeah, it directly impacts it. I mentioned the heat map before, and that Amazon and at Whole Foods was using all sorts of information that they were gathering, and I take it from social media as well, about communications that workers may have been having, and then what's been going on in the area around certain stores to be able to determine where they may have the threat of workers organizing. It's pretty creepy stuff that's going on. There was quite a bit of reporting about Amazon closely monitoring all the labor and union organizing and of their workers in Europe, and that including environmental groups and social justice groups to keep an eye on the social situation there. And I think their response was, well, it's like, we need to be ready to respond if there's some kind of disruptions or whatever. It's like, well, what kind of disruptions are we talking about? We're talking about, workers speaking up to protect their rights, or are we talking about earthquakes? Because my guess is you're not talking about earthquakes.
Great. So I'm wondering if we could just go around and give you each like a couple minutes to kind of conclude here and talk through what are the key takeaways for this audience right now and what we should be thinking about around solutions specifically. We've talked through some of the legislation that's possible out there, but I would love to give you each a chance to kind of share your kind of concluding and connecting thoughts. Michelle Penson, can we start with you?
Sure. So I'd sort of finish asking folks to imagine a couple of things. We've talked a little bit about social media, so this is a good place to start. Imagine if the connections you have online via social media dictated what jobs popped up for you when you were applying for them. Imagine if potential employers could use tools to analyze your facial expressions in a video interview, in order to figure out whether or not you'd be a good fit for a company. And imagine, as we've given plenty of examples of, if after you got a job somewhere, every step you took and everything you did could be tracked and used to make decisions about your employment status. I think it's important to realize that management by algorithm, as I said, is here. And the only way that we are going to have an impact on that is if we step into the middle of it and we are a part of the conversation. That workers have to be a part of the conversation. We have to bargain. We have to make this a part of our everyday fight for workers in order to ensure that they are protected from unnecessary and completely violating surveillance and a control by the use of data collected on them that they have no say in. It's important that we do not allow this to continue to move forward without workers very much in the middle of it.
Thanks, Michelle. Aiha.
Yeah, this kind of threw me for a loop a little bit, but I think I'll answer it in terms of, so I come out of worker rights and worker organizing as well. And I think what I've learned coming to data in society is that data is really, the way that it was originally presented in terms of social media and sort of social, it was really about culture and social change. And even in a work context, it is changing a lot of our basic labor tenets and the way that we think about work. Like, work is being atomized. We're all being judged based on this data about how worthy we are. And that worthiness determines like how much we get paid. how we get promoted, whether we get fired or hired. So I think the data itself is important, but I think there's like an underlying cultural shift that's happening with how people are thinking about who should be worthy and how people should be treated at work. And I think that is something that is sometimes less visible, but I think it's just as important.
Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing, this is, to Michelle's earlier point, this is not theoretical. This is happening to people every day, all the time. And I, personally feel that, we don't have to accept the fact that this can happen without any kind of restrictions or just allow it to go on, completely unfettered. One important piece that we didn't touch upon too much is about transparency. I think just, forcing, employers to disclose exactly what kind of information they're tracking and how they're tracking it would help workers understand, what's happening to them and give them maybe the opportunity to more fully engage in shaping what that might look like.
And Michelle Miller.
One thing that I think is really hopeful. I have been obsessed with this question for about 6 years. And there has been an enormous amount of growth in that period of time in terms of like our collective analysis around technology and the ways in which it's been implemented inside workplaces and other places. If we think back to say 2015, we were in a very techno-utopian moment where like the people making this technology could do no wrong and were saviors for everybody. And that was never correct. But I really feel like the critique and the analysis of the potential harms and the concentration of power within technology companies in Silicon Valley has really been accelerating over the past couple of years. And we even see that among workers who are organizing on our platform. Like a year or two ago, Starbucks told baristas that they all had to download this app called Teamworks that they were going to start doing all their scheduling on. And the first questions that baristas started asking were like, why is this asking for so many permissions? Why is this taking all of my data? Like they knew immediately that there was something off about this. And that is really powerful and it's really different. And so, in this year, we did work with Ship Shoppers, which is Target's gig economy platform, where they themselves, with a little help from a data analyst, tracked all their own pay data so they could track the way that changes in the algorithm were impacting the pay that they were taking home. And they shouldn't have to do that on their own, but they did do that on their own. And that is really incredible, innovative organizing that we all can learn from and start implementing in the work that we're all doing. I am not generally this optimistic, but it is like in labor, as long as people are still organizing, we're still on a path to winning. And what we are seeing is that there are a lot of people organizing around the use of technology inside their own workplaces, and people working inside tech companies organizing around the ethical implications of the technology that they're building. And I think that that really puts us in a position to actually shift what's happening to people inside their workplaces and the broader economy.
That's great. And I think that ties together really well. What we're trying to say here is that there's a specific set of social dynamics right now that are opening up a possibility to rethink how the economy around data is structured. And workers need to be really in the middle of that fight. It's a fight that extends beyond the workplace, but it's really essential for workers to be in there and to be educated and to be driving both inside the workplace and also in public policy and also in the public narrative, frankly, because our values, which is, Aiha's point, multiple times in this conversation, this is about more than just the nitty gritty of how our workplaces are organized. This is really a conversation about how we want our society to function. So I just want to say thank you so much. We're so lucky to have some of these just the most kind of brilliant thinkers on this stuff in this panel today. I'm really grateful for your time and look forward to working with all of you on this in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Amanda. That was fabulous. I want to say David and Aiha, both Michelle's, really your contribution. And when you talk about workers, remembering, and I said this earlier, workers are people and we are all worthy of working with dignity and having some degree of self-determination. And that does come through transparency, communication, and being at the table. So thank you for this conversation. It was very eye-opening, and I hope that we can have more of these discussions as we move forward.